And I want to welcome everyone that's joined tonight to the Catalyst Award workshop focused on target product profile. There's just a couple housekeeping items. One is, at the end of the evening, we're hoping to go into these Zoom breakout sessions, which I did last week, and it works pretty well from my experience. But for those of you that have a telephone number for your name, we won't be able to assign you to the room that you belong in. And so please change your telephone number name to like your real name so that Nate can assign you to your breakout room. The second housekeeping item is that I think it's better if everyone's on mute except for the person talking. The third is, if you have a question, it's better to type it in to that chat function at the bottom of the screen. And then I was told that the usual housekeeping item of telling everyone where the restrooms are, that we don't have to do that tonight. And so my name's Charles Hart. I'm going to start off tonight with an introduction to the role of the target product profile in translation. And then I'm going to turn it over to Rupa Ramamurthy, who's a Senior Associate Director in the Invent Fund at UCSF and as well Catalyst Program. And then she's going to turn it over to Erica Pascal, who's a PhD molecular biologist that then went to law school, and now her practice is totally focused on translational projects. And then she's going to turn it over to Ken Fang, who's a physician and expert in development of diagnostics, and he's going to kind of bring it all together. And so the Catalyst program got started a little more than 10 years ago, focused on helping UCSF professors advance their ideas along the translational path to patient benefit commercialization. We cover 5 different tracks: new drugs, new tests, medical devices, digital health, and biotools. The centerpiece of our program is the Catalyst Awards, and the most significant aspect of Catalyst Awards is our over 200 volunteer industry and academic advisors that mentor and guide projects. And there's also seed funding for the projects. And then we also have a Catalyst internship program through the year. And then we have this sort of special program this summer, Catalyst interns, focused on helping the new teams put together their target product profiles. And so across the 5 different tracks that we support, basically the projects through the years have covered most every type of project you can think of. And in fact, projects that cross over more than one track. In fact, several of the projects just awarded are actually hybrid projects. And it creates an interesting situation in that, as you'll see, that the target product profile you then put together can be a composite of both, or actually it could be 2 separate ones, because there might be a path to a new biotool that will be sold by a company as a probe, or it could be a new drug and sold as a therapeutic. Okay, this is just a snapshot of the different industry expert advisors' areas of expertise. I'm just going to mention a couple. For example, medicinal chemistry, in vitro toxicology, preclinical toxicology, artificial intelligence, reimbursement. So basically, the Catalyst program is a translational accelerator. We help projects advance along the translational path from idea to exit. And actually, we have 2 homes within UCSF, and it reflects our 2 missions. One of our missions is to help principal investigators, students, trainees advance their projects. The other is we help UCSF and the University of California really realize the financial rewards of projects and ideas that get commercialized. And so with respect to the former, we're part of the CTSI at UCSF. That's 11 different programs, Catalyst being one of them. And we're part of Innovation Ventures, which is focused on entrepreneurship and company formation. And we're one of 6 programs within Innovation Ventures at UCSF. And so these next slides are all pretty much about the same. And these basically are sort of like the pipeline of how different product opportunities advance. And pretty much no project ever advances along this exactly. But this first one is focused on new drugs, where you start with identifying a target, developing assays, identify hits, advance them to leads, nominate candidates, etc. Oh, I want to point something out important, or maybe important, maybe not. All these slides are going to be sent to you tomorrow or the next day or the day after. And so if we're going through some of this stuff fast, don't sweat it, because you'll be getting all these slides in a couple days. This is the pipeline for diagnostics. This is the pipeline for medical devices. And my eye notices that with medical devices, it's a little bit different, as the iteration steps between prototype and testing are very, very important. So that's what those curves are indicating. Digital health, and the last one's going to be biotools. And so this slide is actually very, very important. I am going to focus on this slide for just a minute, because it sort of is a snapshot of what a target product profile is. And the second bullet is really the key. It embodies beginning with the end in mind. And the thing I like to point out is that principal investigators are trained to pivot, right? So if they're on the path of their discovery and they're like, oh, this is going to be a great paper in molecular cell biology, and then they realize, oh my goodness, if I take a turn, this could be a Nature paper. And so most professors are sort of trained to follow the data, but we're sort of making the case for sort of a different mindset, which is think about where you want to get to and stick to your knitting, if you will. And so the third bullet, it includes the scientific, technical, clinical, market information that you need. The third is it helps guide R&D. And this fifth one is important. The second from the bottom. This is important because it identifies both the optimal characteristics and the minimal characteristics. And the thing about the minimal characteristics that's key is if you don't achieve a particular minimal characteristic, you really should stop, because you're not going to get to the finish line, probably. And so this is sort of, it can be sort of an empowering process of coming up with the go, no-go decisions. And then the last point is that even though it's going to be all finalized and date stamped or whatever you want to call it, it actually truly is a dynamic document. And so it is the type of thing you want to review in the future and see if it's still relevant. And the last thing I want to say on this slide is that, and this has happened 3 times since I've been here, the professors they put together this TPP, and then 2 years later, they want to use it with a venture capitalist because they want to show that this idea really has legs. And so they come back, they update it, and then the TPP can be used to try to advance your project. This is actually an interesting slide. I just put this in here today because it turns out, this is really interesting. It turns out there's really 3 areas where TPPs are really actively used. The one we're talking about right now is really in industry when they're used as a planning document to advance projects. The FDA encourages the use of TPPs as the basis for communication between the sponsor and the agency. Actually, I have another slide about that. And then thirdly, and this is really significant in the area of global health and developing nations, it's used to set the target for both funders and developers of what the solution needs to be to address global health needs. I already mentioned this. This is actually an official document from the FDA, and the FDA uses TPPs to discuss projects, obviously in this case, drug discovery projects with the agency. This next few slides is sort of a subtlety, but I want to make this point. The target product profile for a pharmaceutical company or the FDA, it's really all the different attributes that they want the drug to have when it's in the pharmacies. And so they basically, it's sort of a prophetic view of what the product label, also known as the package insert, will have. So that really, that super thin paper that comes in your pill box, the target product profile is basically the prophetic view of what you hope that thin paper reads. And this is the snapshot. Actually, this is really what that thin paper, what the product label, what the package insert captures. And this is an example. This is for Humira. This is the first 3 pages of their product label, their package insert, which is 34 pages in length. This is a point I want to make that's also important. I know I've said that these are important like 5 times now, but each of the previous 4 I felt were important. This one I think is important. A target product profile is really what you want the drug to be able to say in its product label, in its package insert. What we're really doing, what we're really doing this summer is really coming up with a target candidate profile. We're really coming up with the attributes that a drug or a diagnostic or medical device needs to go into full development. And so the types of attributes that you're going to sort of conceptualize are on this page here. On the left are the therapeutics, on the right are medical devices. And then for the other 3 projects, they're similar but different. And I just made this slide a few hours ago, and I put in bold at the top and at the bottom. If you look at the bold text at the top and the bottom, these are the things sort of in common. And these are the things that basically the summer interns are going to be sort of focused on, because these are the things that are more like business related, law related, commercialization, regulatory, et cetera, et cetera. I'm getting close to the end here. We put together a list of 40 different databases that will be at your disposal. These are all like public domain databases. And these are things like disease databases of incidence and prevalence, treatment guidelines, patent databases, pharma pipeline databases, genetics, genomics, et cetera. We also have access, actually, for everyone on the call that's at UCSF, part of UCSF, can get access to this it's really a powerful database called Global Data. It's focused on pharmaceuticals and medical devices. And it's basically like a business intelligence database, like I have there at the top. For those of you that are not at UCSF, just write Nate or Rupa or I or Jenny or somebody an email and we'll figure it out. I think this is my last slide. So basically, the schedule for this internship is after today, the principal investigators and their students and their trainees that are on the project full time, and then these summer interns that are going to join the project for a couple months. What you have to do is you got to figure out who's going to do what, and you'll all figure that out. Because those templates for the TPPs, we're going to email you, later today or tomorrow or the next day. And then the next key event is in September, where you present these target product profiles to the Catalyst industry advisors. Now, we've always done this before on site at UCSF. Obviously, this is going to be by Zoom, but it'll be great. And then hopefully, what'll happen is we'll have if you look at the last bullet in that box with the 5 bullets, it's sort of prudent, I think, if you send us a draft sometime late in the summer, let's say late August, and then we can, give you feedback. We'll send it out to our advisors to give you feedback. And the other thing that'll be cool if it happens is a practice session. Hopefully it happens, maybe it won't. But that last box, the bottom box, is really the key box when you present your target product profiles to the industry advisors. And like I said, that's my last slide. And so I'm going to turn this over to Rupa Ramamurthy to discuss project management. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Charles, do you want to take any question and answers before I jump on?
I can. Are there any?
No questions right now. We've been answering them via the chat function, so you're good to go, Rupa.
We're all good.
Okay, I'll just put it in presentation mode. Welcome, everyone. It would have been great to see you all in person, but under the circumstances, this is the way we are doing it. And so welcome all the Catalyst awardees, all the interns. So I'm going to be talking about project management. And like the Warrior Stadium, it was under construction. And of course, now it's constructed. But for a project like that, you need to have a number of steps, and it would be a very complicated Gantt chart with different activities depending on other activities. For example, you have to have the initial foundation before you can build or before you can put electrical connections. So that's a very complicated one. But for Catalyst, it's a much simpler. So the basic project management processes, there is the initiation, the project charter, then the plan, putting together a detailed project plan that includes the scope of the project, that is, what are you going to do with a defined period, the time, the schedule of the project, as well as the cost. And the work breakdown structure is just different work packages that will roll up to the entire scope of the project. You'd have a communication plan, a risk management plan, and the Gantt chart, like the one I showed in the last slide. Then there is the launch and the execution of the project. And while the project is being executed, you're also monitoring and tracking. How is the project tracking compared to the plan in terms of schedule, in terms of cost, in terms of scope and deliverables? And at the end of the project, at the end of the project, there is a report, maybe lessons learned for future projects. And as part of the project management plan, there is a risk management plan. Ideally, you want to say, what are the risks in a given project? What is the likelihood that they will happen, high, medium, or low? If they happen, what would be the impact on the project, high, medium, or low? And a risk management strategy. For example, say there is a sole supplier for a medical device part. The risk would be medium, but if it happens, it would have an impact, a certain impact on the project. So you want to identify and qualify, say, an alternate supplier. Or right now with the COVID situation, like there were certain projects, and I'm involved with some of those projects in project management, and we had to pivot, like go to a CRO for certain parts of the contract research organization because lab space is limited because of all the social distancing guidelines. So how do you get the project back on track? So go to a CRO. And some other projects, it wasn't really possible to do that. So you have to say, okay, the schedule will have to be extended. So for project management for Catalyst awardee projects, so what I'll do is introduce project management, advantages of project management, project goals and aims associated with a specific budget, schedules, and milestones, and tracking of Catalyst project progress against the aims and associated milestones. And Charles already touched on the different project pipelines, therapeutics, diagnostics, medical device, digital health, and biotools. What I want to point out is, say for Catalyst, we will, you may just be doing, say, target identification and validation and hit identification. Or for a medical device, you may be just prototyping and maybe preclinical testing. So it may be one component, it won't be the entire pipeline. And for project management, there's the classic triangle: cost, scope, and schedule. For example, if there's a budget cut and you have to cut the budget, then the scope of the project may need to decrease. Or if the scope of the project is increased, the cost and schedule may have to be increased. And why do you want project management? You want to keep focused on the project goals and aims And there's a Lewis Carroll quote, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And that's not what we want. We want to have a plan. And so you develop a project plan and you track progress against the plan to improve the chances of achieving the goals. And also, of course, this is research and development, even translation, and you may need to pivot and you may need to change. But having a plan enables you to justify the reasons for pivoting, and there is a process for pivoting. So you understand why you're pivoting and why you're changing direction versus the original plan. And project goals and aims, you can think of it like climbing Mount Everest. Your goal may be to get to Everest, but you have to break it down into aims, right? Get to base camp, get to the other camps. And here, for example, and what are the risks? Like say in the Khumbu Glacier, there'd be a big risk crossing that. Or schedule would be really important here because the weather conditions for anyone who's ascending and coming down, they'll have to really do it within a certain time period before the weather gets bad. So for Catalyst, based on what is supported, so the goals is based on what is supported by the Catalyst Award and clear milestones to be accomplished. And the aims associated with a schedule and a budget. For example, one of the milestones may be to achieve compounds with affinity for a target kinase in the low micromolar range and desired selectivity over other kinase targets. So that may be one of the milestones. Then this is just an example where you have different activities, the schedule and the costs associated. For example, for a therapeutic, you maybe have medchem and structure activity relationship, in vitro testing, in vivo, and you have distinct milestones, like you maybe hit identification and lead identification, or in a medical device, the development of the prototype, then maybe in vivo testing, and that gives you some direction that you may have to go back and refine the prototype and then get the design freeze on that. And for project tracking, there is a loop. You have the project plan, then you monitor the project as it is executing versus the plan, compare it to the project's cost, project schedule, and then also, of course, depending on what results you're getting, you may have to replan. And if you replan, to justify why you're moving away from the project plan, what's the rationale, and you may have to replan. And this is just what I already spoke about, the aims versus what has been achieved. Again, milestones to be reached with the given aims. Have those milestones been reached in the given time, in the budget? How is the project tracking versus the plan? And this is just an example, like the proposed and then the actual. So this is just an example. So for example, here, the medchem and SAR took longer than the proposed. So the project schedule has been delayed. Or is another example, say a medical device example, and the proposed, and then the actual prototyping and bench testing was done shorter. So the timeline was compressed. And different resources for Gantt charts. You have MS Project, a Smart Sheet, and at UCSF, you can get a license for Smart Sheet. And I'm just putting an example. I removed any confidential information for a project I project managed here at UCSF for a collaboration. And you can see different activities, and it shows what activities depend on what activities, and to track activities to what % complete. And just as a recap, for project management, you have cost, scope, schedule, and the goals or the aims, and monitoring and tracking the project on what is the plan versus what is actually accomplished. And just leave you with a Dilbert cartoon. And any questions?
There haven't been any questions, Rupa.
Okay, then I will stop share. The one thing I wanted to just add quickly is that for the whole target product profiles, we will be guiding y'all through, and the different program directors will be following up with y'all to give you all more direction as we are going along. So thank you. I guess Erica, it's your time to present.
All right, now that I've got my technical bit sort of halfway done, I will talk to you live from my dining room table where I've been for the last 15 weeks or so. And I am going to talk to you about IP strategy. So as Charles said, I am a scientist by training and now a lawyer, and I work with startup companies from pre-seed stage all the way through about Series C, and do a lot of work with accelerators and incubators, including the UCSF program. So 2 goals for today. One is to talk a little bit about disclosures, kind of the do's and don'ts, which you may or may not be familiar with, and then a bit more on the strategic side for intellectual property. Okay, so one of the big things that to some people is a big different if you've been used to an academic career, is that as you move into commercial development, whether you're a teeny tiny startup with a new idea or a big company like a Genentech or a Pfizer, there's a bit of protecting what's behind the curtain. That is, protecting your innovations from competition, just copying them. So the importance of regulating what you disclose to others, there's many reasons. One, like I said, is the competitive edge, maintaining your head start, but there are some other ones that are very close to tied to developing your intellectual property. And that has to do with the fact that if you want to file a patent, we're on a first to file system, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And it has to be novel and non-obvious, I mean, it's not already out there in the public domain. If you're going to work with trade secrets, and a lot of you are, you need to keep them secret. And then sometimes you have obligations to third parties that you're working with, other companies, other groups that have given you confidential information to help you along with your project, but you need to maintain that confidentiality. So there's lots of types of confidential information. So there's the ones that a lot of scientists think about, very technical information, like what targets you're going after, what's the active agent, the designs and prototypes for a device, software code, assays, results, that sort of thing. But there's also a lot of financial and business information that's confidential, customer lists, who you are working with potential partners. Now you may find as you start to reach out and make relationships that your potential partners aren't quite ready to make that public yet, or you may not, and you want to respect that. There's a lot of financial back and forth between licenses and terms, milestones, who holds equity and how much. Those things are all confidential. And then for those of you who already work in the healthcare setting, you're probably very familiar that there's a lot of health information that has a lot of privacy related regulations. That is a special type of confidentiality. And in addition, for those of you working directly with payers, whether that's the direct consumer or a paying organization, that payment and customer information would be an example. There's also a huge way you can disclose all this information, some of which is intentional and maybe some not so much, right? So discussions and meetings, not just formal ones like the ones you might have, whether these days would be over Zoom or the telephone, or in the days we all sort of remember, where you might bump into someone in the hallway. Purposeful disclosures like research articles, pitch decks, videos, advertisements, things you may not think too much about, social media posts, right? You might, whether it's the casual, this is what I'm doing, for my summer job, or intentional posts about developments in technology. And then there are some activities like grant submissions and clinical trial postings and regulatory, where some aspects of those submissions can become public, and you'll need to think about that. But what we're going to talk about a little bit here is confidentiality, right? What does that mean in this setting that you're working in right now? So for some of you or all of you, you may have signed a confidentiality agreement, whether that's part of your employment agreement already or part of what came about when you joined this program. What does that really mean? It basically means you're going to get confidential information from your what I'm calling your company team or your project team. And that is confidential. You need to keep it confidential. That means don't tell your spouse, don't tell your best friend, don't tell your significant other. I mean, in theory, don't tell your cat or dog, because I really do think they understand you sometimes. No social media posting, no emails, no, I don't even know what all those social media things are, but I'm sure whatever they are, none. If you're going to make your internship the subject of a report when you go back to whether it's UCSF or other school during the term, posters, presentations, these are all going to require permission from your project team if you're going to reveal any company or team information. So basically it comes down to just zip it is the message. Within your team, obviously, when you're meeting together, that's when you can talk about these details. So one of the things I'm also going to touch on really briefly is also the fact, because a lot of these teams, if not all of them, are coming out of a somewhat academic setting, there are some things you really need to think about in managing your intellectual property strategy. And one of them is not publishing prematurely. If you're going to file a patent application, you're going to need to do that before you publish. If you're going to keep things trade secret, for example, software coding is a really good example because it does not make generally for good patents. You're going to need to keep that very securely. For example, password protected access, limited access to things. If you're going to go out and give presentations, you're going to watch what kind of detail you're going to give before you've been able to protect it, say with a patent application. And we've talked about confidentiality agreements. For those of you creating real documents or even electronic documents, I would recommend putting a header or footer that makes them clearly denoted as confidential material of the particular project team, or if you have a small startup company formed it all as well. A certain type of confidentiality is a trade secret. That's basically, to put it in a nutshell, think of something that you want to keep secret, but also has value, right? So the fact that you can't see what color pants I'm wearing today, or rather whether I'm wearing pants at all, that is not a trade secret. I don't think that has very much value, even though right now that's secret. But what your chemical compound looks like and its structure, or maybe what the key difference is in your device prototype from something that's already out there, if you haven't already published it in a patent, that's a trade secret. And the big thing you need to do there, very simple, keep it a secret. As I spoke of before, a big issue with transitioning from an academic background of research into something that's more commercially focused is patents are on a first to file system. So if you publish first, there is a little bit of a grace period, for example, in the United States, but some countries like Europe, you have totally blown your patent rights. So my general advice as a company, or if you're headed towards commercialization, is file first, disclose later. And basically in all this, for thinking about disclosures, whether it's you as an individual or as a project team, is think proactively about the who, when, why, how of disclosures, right? If you're going to make a disclosure, do it for a certain purpose and know who you're disclosing to. All right, quick switch up. We are going to quickly talk about general IP strategy when you are at the startup stage. And I'm going to preface this by saying we're going to go through, kind of a really high level overview. I am around. I live in San Francisco. I will give you my contact information at the end, as Charles and Rupa and Nate know, and Jenny. I am happy to make myself available if you have more specific questions that you want answered. I work as an advisor to the Catalyst team. I will keep everything confidential, and you can ask more specific questions. But at a high level, just to think about for today, when you are, and this feeds into the, the TPP, think about sort of the end game. What is it you want to do with the technology? Are you thinking, do you want to license it out, for example, to a big company, get far enough along, and then have a Medtronic, a Pfizer, you know, what have you, pick it up from there? Do you want to start a startup company, right? Eventually spin it out of the university and go off and do that? Or do you want to stay associated with the university and just build this into a translational project, which at some point someone will figure out what to do with? It might be the university who decides how to license it. Each of these have a different strategy. But the key to strategy is basically two questions. What can you protect, right? And within that, how should you protect it? And when should you go for that type of protection? And an understanding of what else is out there, right? Who else has intellectual property or some sort of competitive position that you're going to need to look at relative to where you're coming from? So thinking about how you're going to protect things, you can look at patents, right? Those trade secrets, trademarks, which really denote things like your product names and company names, copyright. For those of you who work particularly in the healthcare area, regulatory exclusivities, meaning the fact that you need to go through FDA approval and what the FDA will approve, and after you get approval, what they'll allow the competition to do and not to do. You can simply have a first to market advantage, meaning moving really fast. And what's called what I call service-based differentiation, meaning you may just, for example, be offering a diagnostic service that you're just way better at, has way better accuracy than anything that's out there. You can construct a layered approach to protecting your IP. And I'm just using a drug example here just for convenience. It would look a little different with each of the areas that Charles and Rupa mentioned, but for purposes of today, you might have an active ingredient that's your drug, or maybe a combination. Sometimes that drug is already known and you're repurposing it for a new disease. Sometimes it's a completely novel molecule. You can get patent protection on that. You could file patent protection on formulations. You could have methods of manufacturing. Some of that you might just choose to keep trade secret, right? Not tell anyone. Others you might decide to patent. Methods of use, like how you're going to treat patients and what indications your drug is used for, and then other combinations and that might come up. This one can be there is a lot of timing, I should say, that's important for intellectual property, and I could probably spend an entire seminar on that. But briefly, I'm just going to concentrate on the disclosure portion, since that was one of the topics I was asked to speak on. Okay, before you typically file a provisional application for patent protection. If you disclose before that, that's your problem period, as we talked about. Once you've filed that patent application, you can choose to disclose publicly what's in there, but understand that your competitors won't know you filed a provisional application, so that's kind of secret for 18 months. So if you decide to give a talk on it, you're giving your competitors a bit of a heads up there if you decide to put stuff on your website. At that 18-month mark, your PCT, which is called, I'm using jargon, that's Patent Cooperation Treaty. Think of it like the Common College app for patents. You're applying for a patent in many countries at that point. That publishes. So at that point, if you're going to say, submit or get your manuscript published that has the same information, you're not giving anyone any big news. And so that might be something to think about. Finally, what are some of the basic messages if you were going to go out with your idea and try to communicate to investors, whether those be, for example, the Pfizer or Amgen or Medtronic or whoever you're trying to sell your technology to, or whether you have a startup and you're trying to get financing for it? At this early stage, what are you communicating? Three big things. The first is an awareness of a landscape. You're not doing like a deep dive, scorch the earth search, but you want to know who else is out there from a competitive view, not just on the IP side, but in the market, right? If you're doing a treatment for AML, you probably want to know what other treatments for AML are already out there. You want to have a basic idea that you have no big red flags to market at this point, right? So that would be really big things. Like if I woke up today and said, I'm going to form a company that uses CRISPR-Cas9, I should probably be aware that without a license from a number of players, I'm probably going to have a problem because there's a lot of people who have ownership in that area. And finally, a plan for protecting your own innovations. And that's like we talked about. What are the things you're going to use, like patents, trade secrets, regulatory barriers, that's going to give you a competitive position? The icing on the cake is really if you can clearly communicate to investors that you have a plan, it's differentiated from what's out there, and why that plan is going to help you dominate and get a really strong position in the market. And that's where I'm going to stop. This is my contact information. I think you're all going to get these slides, so you will know how to reach me. Email, text, way better than calling is all I'm going to say on that one.
Great. Thank you very much, Erica. You're very helpful continually for us. And we don't have any questions for you at the moment. So Ken Fang, if you're ready, we'd love for you to share your thoughts on the importance of the TPP.
Yep, Nate, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear. Thank you.
All right, I will share my screen. Okay, can you confirm that you can see the screen?
It's
Yes.
good, Ken.
Sorry?
Yes, your screen is visible and you can be heard.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks Nate, Rupa, Charles, again for having me share some thoughts on the target product profile, and welcome everybody to this program. As Charles explained, I've been a Catalyst advisor for a number of years, and my background is I was trained as a physician scientist. I was a house staff and faculty at UCSF for many, many years. My clinical training was in pulmonary and critical care medicine, and I spent many years in the lab doing protein biochemistry. Then I eventually left and went into biotech. And since then, my career is focused on pretty much biomarkers, molecular diagnostics, and devices, and some therapeutics thrown in. So my role has been principally as chief medical advisor at a bunch of companies, generally in the early stage companies. And I've also am consulting now in a similar capacity for many companies right now. Again, mainly sort of early stage, seed to Series B, Series C stuff. So everything that we're talking about today is very pertinent. So in terms of the product profile, this is really, sort of core to every company. And so these are the templates that you either have been given or will be given. And they were really beautifully put together by my colleagues last year. And here you see the two different versions, one on the left for therapeutics and the one on the right for diagnostics. And they did really a fantastic job of organizing and outlining the various sections that can help you really sort of address and to really proceed with the strategy to develop a target product profile. But basically, TPP, it's a fairly straightforward term, but it really is, what are we going to make? And I think that's a really important thing, because I can tell you one of the key things that I do as a chief medical officer is help companies figure that out. Because it's not exactly intuitive, even if they think they do. So people say they want to do cancer, they want to do cardiovascular disease, but ultimately the product has to be really quite well thought out. And the templates that were put together here are really just sort of the beginning of helping you sort of worksheet fashion begin to place those ideas and begin to organize them. And we'll talk about not the detail levels of each section in this particular presentation, but really about how you go about doing it, and really from a collegial cooperative point of view, and the sort of the high level inputs that need to go into developing a product. And so the way I like to start is sort of what Charles was saying. It's really sort of about working backwards, right? And in the sense that you really need to know sort of where you're going, so you can actually optimize the product development. You can optimize the product development pathway along the way. So in example A, the most common thing that most startup companies do is they have a technology. They've got a single cell, sequencing technology. They've got a new, drug target. They've got a new antibody. They've got a new gene sequencing methodology, right? And ultimately, that particular technology platform is great, But then the question is, what are you going to use it for? So technology is not a product. And I think that's something that just needs to be very clear. Unless you're Illumina, where you're going to sell machines as your sole thing, having a good platform or a system is not a product. You can sell it as an RU, as a, you know, as a CRO, as a research company, but in the context of what we're talking about, generally that's not the point, although it can be. And really, in terms of the biotech aspect, it really needs to be correlated with a disease. And, you know, with, again, whether it's, you know, oncology or cardiovascular disease, is really what is the application? And that's really what sort of, you know, I was alluding to, what Charles was alluding to, is that you sort of need to know where you're going. You know, in part B on this slide, in terms of early disease or late disease. So if I want to do oncology is a huge thing. Is, you know, what organ, you know, what type of disease, adenocarcinoma versus squamous cell? Is it going to be, you know, stage 1 cancer, stage 4 cancer? Is it going to be treatment, pre-treatment or post-treatment? So all these things, it's not enough to say you're going to do breast cancer. You sort of have to know really that's it, because otherwise, part C on this slide that's represented graphically is really the key thing in terms of, for any product. It's a little bit more challenging, I would say, in the biomarker diagnostic space, because the drug, you sort of know. I think it's intuitive that people know you're going to target your drug, at least in the beginning, for a particular, you know, along the spectrum of disease. So let's say stage 3 breast cancer. But ultimately, what panel C illustrates is the key concept of clinical utility. So clinical utility is a pretty well-established definition now for about 10 years, which is basically, what is the benefit with respect to either A, a clinician's decision, and B, with respect to patient outcome? So again, so clinical utility generally is comprised of either one or both. You have to either change what the physician does, or there has to be some benefit, some improvement in patient outcome. There are many things that may be good or beneficial in terms of, you know, helping you lose weight, but if it doesn't change the physician decision or the patient outcome, you're basically not going to have great clinical adoption, either from a regulatory or from a payer or just from clinicians and patients. So the clinical utility concept of C is really, really important. So those are really sort of the overview. So developing a product, in summary on this slide, is really thinking about, as Charles said, where really do you want to go? And this is a very, very difficult thing. And I'm working with a company right now who's addressing this very issue. They have a great technology, and they're trying to figure out what's the, you know, what people call the quote killer app, right? So people want to know, you know, what's the best investment of my next 2 years of funding to develop a product, and in which disease should I go, and what's the optimal clinical utility? So what I want to do in this presentation is focus as an outline is really, you know, the company role of the TPP. In other words, you know, where does it fit into sort of the operational, part of how a company is? And the short answer is it's the core of what a company does. And people may not call it, they may not think they're doing project management or TPP development, but essentially from the very beginning, you're thinking about really where you're going to take your science. And then the next bullet point is really talking about, you know, what are the conceptual things that you need to achieve along the way. Things like prioritization is always really important, you know, meaning focus. Corporate alignment is really the concept of making sure that what you think is what your CEO thinks is what the board of directors thinks. Because if there's not alignment, I can tell you there's a big problem. Because people are doing many things and heading off in different directions. The third bullet point, what I mean by build for need, is it's really a good idea to make a product that a customer wants rather than what you think they want. Because time and time after again, making what you think they want generally doesn't work out. And it's a really good idea, as part of that working backwards, is to figure out what the need is, not what's written in the paper, but actually what practicing physicians and patients really perceive the need to be. And I've already mentioned the clinical utility, again, about changing physician decisions and also about changing patient outcomes. Some of the concepts that we'll be talking about as part of this TPP development are, one is intended use. So intended use is a great term that's actually really evolved now into the clinical practice realm, where most clinicians who work with companies and a lot of academicians now understand what intended use is. And I can tell you in the beginning they didn't. So intended use is really a regulatory statement that specifically defines the clinical application that your drug or your device or your biomarker is going to work in a specific target population, right? And we'll talk about that in specific later. The concept of a total available market is all the people all the patients and the particular disease area that you can potentially reach with your product that's going to achieve some revenue goal based on how you apply how you define and apply your product. So that's a really important concept. So in other words, how much money potentially can you make in terms of a commercial value? Because you could have a great idea and a great intended use, but if let's say it's an orphan indication with 10,000 patients per year, you're either going to make very little money, or you're going to have to charge a couple $1 million per patient, which is what some companies do, right? And then the third concept is really about society practice guidelines, which is essentially saying that if something's recommended in the cardiovascular guidelines, it's going to be that much easier for everybody to adopt your product, both from payers and clinicians and patients. And I think that even though practice guidelines weren't developed that way originally, they have basically become to be relied upon by many people as a quote source of quote approval that the application of the product is going to have merit. So the key points that I'd like you to take home from this presentation is really knowing what the market wants and letting that guide you in terms of your TPP development. Again, don't build what you think they want. Try to figure out what they want before you build it. The second thing is really in terms of the project management that Rupa was talking about, is really thinking about, you've got the ingredients beyond the hard sweat that goes into it is the vision, the resources, the amount of money you have, and the talent that you have on your team, and the amount of time you need. Because again, you could think of a great product that could take 10 years to develop, and if your company only has 2 years of funding, it's not going to be a good marriage of concept with resources. The other important thing of the TPP is that it's not like you write it down and it's fixed forever. It's a living document, and it will change. So it's really something that everybody uses as sort of like a worksheet, and also as a goal, because it has to be completed at some point. The intended use, similarly, is an offshoot of the TPP. It's really about not what my idea is as a clinician, what I think. There's many other inputs, and we'll talk about that in detail. And then the last bullet point is really what we're talking about in terms of the total available market is, think about where you're heading to. It may be a great clinical indication for stage 3 breast cancer, but is there a need for this product? Can I charge enough when I make it? How much will it cost to make over the next couple of years? And then eventually, is it currently in the guidelines, or how many studies will I have to do to get it accepted into practice guidelines? So in terms of the role of the target product profile, right? So what I've tried to illustrate here in this slide is that, again, it's basically it's a goal, it's a document that's going to be, everybody in the company will be generally called either a multidisciplinary or a group approach to product development. Typically, people think it's the scientists and the clinician get together and they got the science, they got the clinical stuff. We figured out what the product is. And if you do it that way, I can guarantee you're going to have problems, because ultimately the downstream understanding comes down to understanding, hey, what does a commercial team need to sell it? What kind of data do they need to be able to go to a doctor and say, here's how the product works, right? What's the regulatory agency going to ask you in terms of, well, Ken, here are the analytical specifications your product has to meet before you can market it, right? In terms of the bioinformatics team, they say, hey, Ken, we can develop that product, but we need 10,000 more data points, or we need 5,000 more blood samples to do that. And the manufacturing guys may say, hey, look, we can manufacture that, but it's going to cost 10 times more than you think, or it's going to take 5 times longer than we think to hit that goal. And then the dark blue box reimbursement is really the key of everything. No matter how good the product is and how good the product concept is, if it's not going to get paid for, if you don't think about how it's going to get paid for from the day you start, that's a big problem. So really, the TPP is a repository, and I recognize that, particularly your stage, and even many companies, right? We may not have a manufacturing guy. We may not have a commercial guy. We may not have a reimbursement guy. And luckily, most companies at early stage have enough, seasoned people that you can wear different hats. But ultimately, you work with consultants, or you work with people like Erica and me, and we can provide some inputs. But the idea is to make sure that even if you don't have that person, look at this wheel of inputs as things that you should consider, at least all of these aspects, these disciplines as you're developing your TPP, not just your own, and that will really hold you in good stead. The other. So I was alluding to the last slide in terms of process priorities, right? Is think about what you need early on in the process, right? So like a very common one that I experience is when you're doing biomarker analyses, people don't realize that centrifuges are not in clinics. And so no scientist would know that, but I basically tell people, look, a lab is like your kitchen. A clinic is like your kitchen. If it's not in the kitchen, it's not in the lab. If your specimen requires centrifugation, you don't have a product. So little things like that really need to be thought about. And then really thinking about, again, the timelines are probably, even more important than the money. You can always get more money, but you can't get more time. And that's really sort of the bane of every product development in terms of project management. The scope and feasibility, I had alluded to it as well, is that let's say you want to build a car, right? Well, you have to decide, you're going to build a big car or a small car. And you have to decide, well, how much metal do I have? How much time do I have? Do we have the right talent and skills, right? And then bullet point number 4 is related to that, which is about risk mitigation, right? So I think one of the things that really defines a well done and an experienced team is identifying what the risks are. But in addition to identifying what the risks are, you also have to figure out how you're going to solve and mitigate those risks. So in other words, if I'm going to develop a new drug, or if I'm going to develop a new biomarker test, right? Is a competitor going to scoop me on that? Is the drug going to cause side effects? Am I going to have a manufacturing problem? So you have to think about all these things in advance and then tell your CEO, okay, well, here's what we think the risks are, and here are our 3 strategies for how to mitigate them. So we're going to, get an expert on drug toxicity to help us. We're going to buy extra metal to build the car and whatnot. And anybody who tells you there's no risk hasn't really done the thought process. So I think if you can really think about risk to your program, it generally wins people really good marks. And ultimately, if the last bullet point is what your job is as the implementing team is, your job is to provide options to the management team, whether it's the CEO, the C-level people, or the board, is that every plan has a plan B and a plan C. And so understanding how you develop the TPP will really help you think about the options in terms of building a lesser product or a different product, as Charles and Rupert were talking about in terms of pivoting between different options. So you always would like to have that, and it's a challenge when you're trying to focus on one TPP. I alluded to this when I first started in terms of corporate alignment, and what I mean by, so for those of you who haven't worked in a company, right? So the hierarchy of a company is basically you have the executive team that's led by the chief executive officer, and then you have other C-level people, including a chief medical officer, chief financial officer, chief scientific officer, chief commercial officer, etc. At the board level, you generally have 3 to 5 to 7 board, directors on the board, with usually a chairman of the board. And then you also have founders who may or may not be with the company, and then other investors who may not be on the board. And what's really important is understanding not only what the product you'd want to develop. So somebody says, I want to develop a drug for breast cancer. Somebody else says, look, I want to do something for CRISPR for diagnostics. Well, you can't do both. And it's very important to have this alignment earlier on, again, because of the time aspects and the resource limitations. And even among the management team, there can be differences. So the communication is really the central ingredient of a good TPP effort. And I really can't emphasize that enough. The other thing in terms of building a TPP is really about metrics, is about thinking quantitatively. In addition to how much money and time you have, is can you anticipate or forecast what the impact is of your product? If I have a new drug for breast cancer, is it going to do what? Is it going to save lives? Is it going to decrease time to recurrence? Will it decrease the amount of side effects? And if so, is it in 10%, in 20%? And how does that translate into commercial value? So if I invest $10 million into that project, will I make 30 million or will I make $1 billion? Right? Because it all has to do with risk and reward. And so metrics are really something that you have to think about every point along the way. It's not enough to say, I want to do stage 3 breast cancer. You need to know, okay, well, how many patients have stage 3 breast cancer? How many people are going to get this drug? How many people will you actually enroll in the study, and what proportion of people can you get? So all these things will come to play in terms of the feasibility aspect of your TPP design. And then, as we've already talked about many times already, is the resources and the timelines. The number one thing is the talent, is getting the people. Hiring is probably the most time consuming, but also the most critical of any company. Because if you don't have the right talent, it doesn't matter how much money you have or how much time, it's going to be very difficult to navigate the process to get this kind of thing done. I've mentioned a number of times the issue about build what the market wants. And this is really, again, a very important thing. So in my first, the person who introduced me to biotech told me, he says, Ken, there's 3 things you have to know. You have to know, will the physicians use it? Will the FDA approve it or clear it? And will the payers pay for it? Okay. The answer to those 3 questions has to be yes, right? And I think one of the other, in the top 5 things that I've learned in biotech, one of the most important things is marketing analysis, right? People tend to think of marketing as, sort of, big parties at medical conferences and, people dressed in nice suits selling you something. That's part of it, but marketing is really about intelligence. It's about 2-way intelligence, understanding, doing the correct surveys, doing quantitative surveys, because the key stakeholders are, as written, right, are the patients, the physicians, and the clinical societies, right? So if the American Heart Association says something, you probably should listen. And then among physicians, there's a substantial difference between academicians and practitioners. Neither one is better than the other one, but they have very different perspectives on what's needed. Academicians like to power the trials, but unfortunately, a lot of the trials are not representative of the patients that practitioners see because they're somewhat limited to control for certain populations. Certain exclusions apply that can make the results, no matter how good they are, less applicable to general practice. And so, typically, what happens is any product, including drugs that are released into the general use, don't perform as well as they did in trial settings. And then the other thing we talked about was in terms of, regulatory can be either at the FDA level or other levels for biomarkers or for diagnostics. And insurance companies, the payers, are critically important in terms of whether they're private payers like Blue Shield or United Healthcare, or if it's going to be CMS and Medicare type things. Because again, each of them, the more you know what they like and they don't like, or what the opposite is going to be, the better it's going to be. Now, again, you're going to say, hey, Ken, I don't know any of this. I don't know anybody who knows this, and that's fine. I think but I think that there are certain things you that are in the public domain that you can look up and see what actually has happened in terms of the last stage 3 breast cancer drug that was approved, or some similar type of thing to get a sense of what the metrics are. And then the other key piece here that I have as a dotted line to pair are health economists, because the value proposition of a product is really should be about how it benefits the healthcare system in addition to the clinical utility. So I would say clinical utility affects at the patient level, the individual level, then the health economics benefit affects the broader population level. So if we can reduce mortality by 10% in a really, really tough disease, that's probably significant. If we can reduce, side effects by 20% in other things, that's probably significant. But all that can be calculated and modeled. And so ultimately, it influences not only whether you should go down that path, but again, also the commercial corporate strategy about getting reimbursed and getting paid. So again, these things, obviously no one person and no one company has all these resources, which is why, again, you need to either hire them for periods of time or get consultants. We talked about the clinical utility, and again, I can't emphasize this enough. This is super important because, again, a lot of people don't really understand that there's a difference between clinical value and clinical utility. It has to make a difference in terms of clinical decisions and outcomes. And also the subsequent bullet points is, what am I doing that's different? Is this the next Me Too, 5th immuno-oncology drug? Is there cell therapy, right? Have I unknowingly created a problem that's going to make things worse? So in other words, if I'm trying to treat a disease, but I actually create a really bad side effect, does that mitigate the actual benefit? If I increase survival, but if I increase infection rate, that's not a good trade-off, right? So ultimately, the value, the efficacy of a product will really depends on the price, not just in terms of dollars, but also in terms of the clinical side effects, and also, what it might do to the patient. One of the last sort of concepts I really want to talk about is this issue of intended use, which is again a very something that most people who are not in the industry are not familiar with. So again, it evolved from an FDA perspective. It's really about a regulatory statement that tries to specifically identify what the clinical application of a product is going to be. And so at the regulatory level, particularly with the FDA, each word of this is a potential negotiation, because the FDA process is actually pretty straightforward, as much as people like to malign it or complain about it. But the FDA's job is to make sure that what you're asking, what you're claiming your product to do is actually supported by the data. And so the more specific you are, the better it is. And they will limit your intended use based on the data that you show to support your claims. So what I have here on this slide is showing an example of a lung nodule on a CAT scan, which may or may not be suspicious for lung cancer, in this case, in the bottom left-hand quadrant of that CT scan, that big white spot. Okay, so you could write an intended use that says, okay, the intended use is to provide clinicians with a tool for lung cancer screening. That's fine, but it's pretty ambiguous, right? So, when do you screen? What type of patients do you screen? And the second one is a better, more refined example in terms of, it says, to aid clinicians in the assessment and identification of patients who are asymptomatic, meaning they have no idea they have anything wrong. They have no symptoms. That's radiographically identified, meaning that it has to be seen on a CT scan or chest X-ray, which are likely to be benign, meaning that they're not malignant or not cancerous, right? So that's a much more defined intended use that should be, again, supported by the data. And so the crafting of the intended use is very important when you submit your documentation, and also when you're from a commercial marketing point of view, and also when you're talking to payers and clinicians. Everybody needs to understand exactly what your product does. So again, this is not particularly, I'm not saying that it's easy, but ideally your intended use should be pretty clear. And obviously it should have a direct link to the clinical utility, that change in physician behavior, and that change in patient outcome that you're trying to achieve. So the last concept is what I talked about in terms of total available market. So which is basically a fancy term for what is the potential financial gain for a company if I choose to have a particular application. So what will my product generate if I apply it in a particular situation? So it's a pretty straightforward calculation. In general, the math in biotech is pretty straightforward, right? So what I've just shown simplified here is that it's really the number of candidate patients who are eligible for the product, okay? And that can be quite broad in certain cases, right? So if it's therapeutics, it's a number of people who are, again, at stage 3 breast cancer, not stage 2 or stage 4, right? Or if it's for biomarkers for lung nodule screenings, it's people who are asymptomatic, not symptomatic, right? So all those features will define your candidate population. The next thing is the price, whatever you set the price as, right? And then the frequency of use, meaning how many times can I charge for this product in the time for this particular patient. So for a drug, they generally charge either by dose or by administration or by the course of the drug. For a device, they might charge you every time you use it. So the simple example just says, okay, if I have 100,000 patients who I can use it in, and the price costs $1,000, and I use it twice, my total available market might be $200 million. But let's say the total number of patients is 1 million, right? So if the total number of patients is 1 million, but I think that my eligible population is 100,000, then I'm going to achieve 10% of the TAM, which is pretty good. Right? So it really depends on what you're claiming. And every investor and every board will talk about this as a criteria for how you're going to develop and prioritize your product. And what the bottom portion of that slide just shows you the relationship between clinical utility and the economic value of your product. So in other words, the higher the clinical utility, the more you can influence patient outcome and the physician decision, the more you can charge, the more valuable financially that product is going to be, presuming that there's no other options, okay? And so the further right with the single dollar sign means that your clinical utility isn't great. In addition, there's tons of other things you can do instead of it, so you're not going to be able to charge a lot of money for that. And then the triple dollar one says, okay, I've got a pretty good clinical utility. There's not many other options out there, so therefore I can justify a higher price. Okay, so that's really the interpretation in terms of a general strategy. So you're gonna have to balance out, what you want to do versus what you can do. And then, as Eric was saying, this is sort of the equivalent of the freedom to operate. Is the do you actually want to participate in this space and try to develop a competitive product? And there may or may not be other things out there to compete with you. In terms of the practice guidelines, I already mentioned this. So this is something that, again, so practice guidelines are something that every clinical practice society issues every couple of years, and they basically set the standard, and they will say explicitly, surgery should be performed on people with these symptoms, with these results, and surgery should not be performed on this. or cancer should be screened for cervical cancer in women above the age of 21 who have this, but not screened for women below the age of 20, that kind of thing, right? And the way they decide the guidelines is it's all based on data, what they call levels of evidence. So let's say the top level of evidence is 3 phase 3 trials of, with a performance metric of X. And so you can have different levels of quality of recommendations, strong, moderate, or weak, depending on how much data you have. But the challenge is that there's different societies. There's different societies within the United States. There's the American Society versus the European Society, and they may not agree. So you have to think about, how do I satisfy everybody? And you may not be able to. And even though practice guidelines were meant for clinicians, but in the last, couple of decades, they've basically been co-opted by everybody else to use as sort of a standard. Say, okay, if it's covered in the guidelines, great. If it's not covered in the guidelines, it doesn't mean your product won't be used, but then your job is to generate the data to help people decide to cover your product in the guidelines. So again, my key takeaway from this, and we covered a lot of important material, is try to really understand what the market wants. And you've got a great technology, a great idea, but you really have to think about, what the true need is, and what the market, meaning clinicians and patients and the FDA and the payers want. And some sort of marketing approach is really very valuable. Think about aligning what everybody wants to do with how much money you have, how much time you have, and the vision of the company. The key analogy people use in biotech is you don't want to build a bridge halfway across the lake, because that doesn't get you anywhere. Meaning that if you run out of time or run out of money, a bridge halfway done has no value. As I said, the TPP is a living document. It's something that is a place to put all the ideas on and put all the requirements down. But at the same time, eventually you have to decide on one product and then make that product without changing it. And the intended use, again, is related to that TPP, is just saying, okay, well, how do we define all the characteristics that will help us achieve the optimal clinical utility, or define that impact on decision-making and patient outcomes that we can achieve. And then finally, as we talked about also, you're a company, and this is not just a pure exercise. You really need to figure out how you're going to create, dollar financial value for your company, and get this ideally into practice guidelines so you can achieve the corporate financial goals of the company. So thank you again for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions. And as Eric has mentioned too, I'm happy to take questions by email as well. And I'm sure the Catalyst folks can send you my contact information.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Fang. We did have a question come in. Who normally writes the TPP industry? Is it the discovery scientist? Is it the C-suite? Somewhere in between?
Yeah, that's a really good question in terms of, well, so I think what Rupert was talking about, so there's so typically the way it works is, right, so if I go back to this slide, right, so this is again talking about sort of the different groups. So there's, in every company, they'll either be an individual person or a team. Big companies will have dozens of people, hundreds of people in each of these colored, areas. But central to it is a project manager. So there's, say, a project manager is a very valuable key player, a very valued profession in industry, and that person is essentially the quarterback of the entire team, irrespective of how senior any of the other people are in those areas, right? As to who actually writes it, it's a really good question. I mean, as a clinical guy, I've written a lot of them, but typically the way it works is it is a living document, and so everybody who's in those colored areas will have to sign off at the end. So the way it evolves is that typically people will write their area of expertise, that section, and then it will get put into some sort of shared document where people will begin to edit it, and then periodically, every week, every other week, every month, whatever's decided, everybody will get together and essentially do a red line and try to debate and advocate for what they want, or say, well, gee, Ken, I understand what you want, but we can't achieve that. What can we achieve? Can we do it in stage 2 breast cancer instead of stage 3, or can we achieve a 10% mortality reduction instead of 15%? So basically, the answer is everybody writes it, and then somebody will have to sort of do the final shaping. It's typically not the project manager, but it's typically at bigger companies, they're actually VPs of product development. But ultimately, it is a team effort in terms of the actual document construction.
Great. And another question, you were talking a lot about the different market sizes, total addressable market. how does one estimate how much of the total market that they'll be able to capture?
Yes. So obviously, it's the one way to answer that question. It's basically a percentage of what you think the denominator is going to be, right? So in this particular case, I've used the 100,000, but let's again. So it's 1,000. So the way you find this is you basically have. This is what I've been doing for the last 2 weeks for this company is looking for metrics, right? It's the company's job or somebody's job to figure out what it is. So let's say my analogy for we're developing a drug for stage 3 breast cancer. Okay. Well, how many breast cancer patients are there every year? So the answer is there's about 200,000 new breast cancer cases every year. Okay, what percentage of them are stage 2? Let's call it 30%. Okay, so that's 60,000 out of 200,000. Okay, and then so that's stage 2. Now I want to know what people are candidates for my drug. So maybe it's 70% of that, right? So my denominator has gotten pretty small from the original 2,000 when I start segmenting by various requirements. Okay, so you got to figure out what your denominator is first by that general thought exercise I went through. And then your numerator comes down to then what you estimate your population is going to be, and then adding the price points and the use frequency. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. Thanks, Dr. Fang. And there's another question that came in for Erica. She's no longer able to be on the call. And the question was, how can we educate ourselves further about the IP process and the importance of timing? And Erica says that she has written about this on her blog the last few years. So if you go to ingensity.com/blog, you'll be able to find it. And we can also send that out to everybody. Charles in the beginning mentioned that he's compiling a list of resources for everybody, and we can add Erica's blog certainly to that. All right. So without further ado, unless Charles or Rupa, you have anything, I think it's a good time to transition to the breakout rooms.
That sounds good.
All right, great. Dr. Fang, thank you very much. So I'm opening the breakout rooms now, and there are a bunch of people who I couldn't tell their name. So stay on the line and we'll try and find you your right room.
And just a quick thing on the breakout rooms, y'all will get to introduce yourselves, and people haven't yet signed CDAs, so have a non-confidential discussion. This is just getting to know each other.
Yeah, are we
Charles
expected?
and Rupa, thank you very much for everything. Enjoy the rest of the session.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks a
Okay.
lot.
Are we expected to come back to the main session after the breakouts, or just
No.
breakouts and then finish?
No, let me just say a couple words. I want to thank Rupa and Erica and Ken for really great presentations. I learned a lot myself, and hopefully this breakout room will work out. And what you'll be getting this week is the PowerPoint presentations. You'll also be getting the TPP templates. You'll also be getting some of these resources and some other stuff. And to answer that last gentleman's question, no, these breakout sessions, introduce yourself, and then I noticed it's about 10 minutes to 6 Pacific time here, Pacific Daylight Time. And so we thank you all for joining. And then just when you're done chatting and you have some sort of awkward silence, you can just shine it on, and thank you very much.
Great. So most people should have received the invitation to join the private room now. Feel free to do so now. For those who haven't received that, please stay on the line, and we'll try and put you in the correct room. So I have a Charles BLAHA.
That's Shuo Roy's.
Okay. Thank you. We have a CKOUGENTAKIS.
I'm in Diane Barber's group.
Thank you. DEGELTHALER.
He's in John Metcalf's group.
All right, thank you. Francesca Olosio, are you with William?
I'm in Diane Barber's group.
Diane Barber, great. Jason Limberis.
John Metcalf as well.
Jimmy.
Shumo Roy.
Jonathan Lee.
I'm with Adam Abate.
All right. Lucia Paca.
I'm with Wally van Thiel on the Engage RX project.
Thank you. Carly, we received your submission earlier today, but we didn't have a chance to assign you for now. So apologies.
Okay, no problem.
And then
You can just talk to us.
Jazzy, I thought we assigned you to somebody. Please stay on the line. Jazzy, you're with Doris Wang.
All right.
All right. Rutu Hansu Sa. Please forgive me if I didn't say that correctly.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's Ratanshu.
Hanshu. Are you in somebody's lab or are you?
No, so I believe I sent in my rankings just earlier today. So, and you had told me that I wouldn't be assigned until later, but I just wanted to stay on to see if there were any updates.
Okay, no, we haven't assigned you to a group yet. But yes, I did see it come in.
Okay, no problem.
Nate.
Yes, Charles.
I see Peter Neumer here. He's one of Barry's EIRs, and he's with Pam England's project.
Oh, awesome.
The Neuro1 project.
Thank you. We'll put Peter and Pamela England's. Great. Thank you, Peter.
Super. Thanks.
And the four of us can tag team Carly now.
Yeah. Charles, Jenny, Rupa, do you want me to put you into any group?
Yeah, I know none of the PIs are here for Chaz, so I was just going to jump in there.
Right, sending you there.
Great,
And
thanks.
in mine, which of my projects people are there in? Are there anywhere there's no PI for my projects?
I don't know, Rupa. I'm sorry.
Okay, just put me in any group that means either Jennifer Chen or Shubo. I think Shubo has covered. Put me in either Jennifer Chen or Ying Han or.
All right, I'm going to send you to Valley just because there's. Or no,
no, Valley's Jenny.
But you can exit that group and come back to this waiting room, and then I'll put you in another one if you want. So sending you to Ying Han now.
Okay, I'll do that.
All right, and Chuck, where do you want to go?
I think I'm good right here in my dining room. No, I'm kidding. No, I was serious. But I was actually serious about Carly that doesn't have a group. But if Carly has any questions about the Catalyst program or the summer or wait, she wasn't assigned to a project. There she is.
Yeah, I'm here.
Got her assignments relatively right before this meeting.
Yeah, I think I only got the projects on Monday. So
Okay, yeah, no, totally fine. We'll get you into a group. And this conversation that they're having right now isn't super serious. It's just a very.
Carly, where are you? What do you do?
I'm in San Francisco right now, and I just graduated from Stanford this past year.
Oh, congratulations.
Or in June.
What are you doing now then?
I'm just basically taking the summer off before starting medical school.
Wow. Where are you going to go to medical school?
At Hopkins.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
What'd you study at Stanford?
I did biomechanical engineering for my undergrad, and then I did a 1-year master